My toxic trait is that I try to help people, even if I don't necessarily understand the problem myself. So when every so often someone pops up on the Bolt Action socials asking about why the Warlord Games metal artillery models are so bad, it is my natural response to say, well, that sounds like a skill issue, but I'm going to spend the 4 hours it takes to work out the answer and edit a nice little video to help people go through that process. Every now and again, that process doesn't necessarily work. And so when I got this German 10.5cm LEFH 18, it gave me the perfect opportunity to get stuck in and see why so many people have trouble with this type of kit. Thank you to my local group for me winning this as a prize recently, and to Anna for packing it. You'll notice that the crew aren't present, but that's not Anna's fault. I've already separated those out to claim them for painting. The first thing that I notice is the kit doesn't have a physical instruction sheet included, but if you go to the Warlord Games product page, there is a fairly well detailed exploded view. Now it's not perfect, and we'll have to come back to some other methods to work out how to build the model later on. What it does tell me is all I need to know about cleaning up the parts. There's all sorts of sprue and flashing on every single piece, so working out what's the model and what isn't is our first challenge. For example, the gun itself has a big old bar of a sprue piece that has to be removed. I can see clearly in the XP view that the tube is part of the model and the bar is the sprue on top, and so I cut that and smooth it down. I also note the shape of the muzzle brake, as it is slightly bent. And yes, I should be using tweezers, but the clippers were closer. Don't make my lazy mistakes. I quickly noticed that the barrel, loading ramp, and pretty much this whole piece wasn't perfectly straight or even actually remotely straight at all. Bending this type of metal is really easy, but bending it back to being straight takes a little care. If you just grab it and try and bend it the opposite direction, you'll end up with two bends, making an S shape rather than a straight line. Instead, you have to hold it all the way up to the original bend at both sides to ensure you're unbending that original bend. I look next at the central piece, which I will refer to as a trunnion, although that might not be the correct term. Ignoring the surface details, the actual structure of this piece is a U shape that is supposed to have a nice 90-degree corner at the bottom. But in transport, it's been bashed around and bent. Again, I take care to bend this back along the original bends to end up with a nice square and flat finished piece, rather than a wibbly-wobbly S-shaped bendy mess. The rest of the pieces were easier to understand in this case. The carriage has axles for the wheels. I eventually worked out that these tabs are for the recoil legs, and the tools go onto the square pegs on the front. You do have to be careful even when cleaning mold lines, as this metal is so soft that I kept bending and crushing pieces as I was going. The very smallest last pieces, thankfully these three adjustment wheels are the same, so I don't have to keep track of which one's which, and the aiming telescope a fairly clear picture in the X view. I did have to be extremely careful though, as these parts are so thin that scraping with a knife can easily collapse or bend or even snap these pieces. I think the spindliest and most fragile piece is the tool handles. It has two lumps of metal with the smallest, thinnest bars that are the tool handles themselves, with even some flashing in the middle of those tool handles. Take care, take your time, use a sharp knife so you don't have to push too hard, and when you inevitably bend it, unbend it back along the original bends so you don't end up with a wibbly wobbly curve and instead have a nice straight line. So with the parts all cleaned of their mold lines and flashing, I still want to wash these parts as well. It is vitally important to wash resin models, but I have found it is endlessly helpful also for metal models. Superglue will often stick to the powder used as a mold release instead of the metal, and that can lead to a lot of difficulties in gluing if you don't wash them. That doesn't take long to do, a few minutes, and then leave them out to dry for a few hours. And we can finally get into actually assembling the model. Now, because the instructions are so lackluster and the parts are so fragile, I make the effort to test fit every single connection before I even take the cap off my superglue. In several places I'm not 100% sure on something, which way something goes, where it attaches, and the X view isn't enough in every case. The second place to go is images of the finished model. Thankfully Warlord Games website has a few good ones in this example, but after that, as this is a historical model, I can look at historical photographs to get better angles. The old Google image search for the weapon in question gets you all sorts of photos in seconds, sometimes historical photos, sometimes from museums. And so, time for superglue at last. And now that I know how each part attaches, I'm pretty confident I have a good idea of the order that each part should go together as well. I start, in this case, with the carriage wheels. The axles seem to be a little long, so I snip them down, and that means that the surface area of the wheel is going to touch directly against the carriage to give a bigger surface for glue. I do add a little bit of baking powder as a cheap kicker for the superglue. Water kind of works, but there are proper real kickers out there if you want to pay money for them. Not always needed, can be handy. The tools go easy on the front. There's a tiny bit of keying there that fits once the parts are straightened out. The legs also going on, and I cheekily take advantage of the nature of the metal for these, as I can slightly bend inwards on the attachment part in a kind of pseudo crimp, making for a tighter fit. I superglue those on and then prop up on some random pieces that happen to be nearby so that it sets in the right position, kind of the way I want it to. A little bit later on I'll add more superglue, baking powder and more superglue just to make sure these joints are nice and strong. With the middle of the model, the gun shield glues down onto the trunnion and kind of presses all of the way back, so there are features of the trunnion to give a good gluing surface, and I got this from the historical photos. Now I know that the gun can be fed through this assembly because I tested that beforehand, but where that attaches is a round peg on a flat ledge. And I'm really glad that I took the time earlier to straighten out the trunnion, because trying to bend this to hold onto the gun at this stage, well, that'd just be a pain. Cracking superglue and bending other pieces by mistake, just a whole mess. But because there wasn't really a round hole to hold onto the round pegs, I propped the gun up in a similar way to how I propped up the legs earlier and flooded the joins a couple of times with superglue to make sure that it was completely set. Before I glue this upper assembly to the carriage, I'm taking advantage of it being separate to glue all of the little bits on. The adjustment wheels go where the exploded view says they go, as does the aiming piece, but I did check against some historical photos to check which way up the aiming piece would be, and finally I glue the trunnion to the carriage. The hole for this attachment, let's be generous and say that it isn't completely concentric. Well, as most of this kit isn't necessarily all lined up and square, even with my attempts to bend things back into shape, I'm going to use a little bit of a visual trick. By having the gun pointing slightly to one side, it's easier to not notice the crooked nature of the model. And oh, would you look at that? Ain't that look good? I actually do think it looks really nice. Even though it's been a little more work than I expected, the detail is good on the model and it comes with loads of ammo boxes and all the crew that you'd need. All that's left is to finish it off with paint. Now I tried to base coat with my airbrush, but it was clogging, and so it just ended up as a mediocre zenithal of blue-grey, but that works out fine for me, as I'll be relying on a black wash in a moment for most of the detail. I did pick out some of the basics, the tool handles, tyres and the red and white warning bars before the black wash, and then after the black wash, hey, you saw it coming, an edge highlight. It was going to be an edge highlight at some point, and that's it. Job is a good one. Someday I will paint the crew, the accessories and the base, but that is not this day. The important bit, the gun itself, is difficult, but it is complete. And I am forced to admit that this is more difficult than I gave it credit for. I expected that everyone complaining was just trying for 13 seconds and then resorting to the internet for help, and I'd spend a few hours to get it right and teach how in a simple way. Now, whilst it did take me a few hours, kind of what I expected, It is a very long time for what really should be a very easy and quick to build model. But the difficulty in the build is one of the concessions of the detail that the model shows, and it is a somewhat spindly model. Metal is very good for small production run items, but it's not so good for physically small models. Some people claim that metal models don't hold good detail, and that's just straight up not true. It's not the 1980s anymore. The Warlord artillery models have really good detail, but because the parts are physically so small, so thin, the metal ends up fragile, leading to weak, bent or even broken parts. That said, they aren't that difficult to build if only the instructions are a little clearer. Certainly not compared to some of the model kits from the 1980s. Good grief, there were some difficult ones back then. So whilst I think these metal artillery models are a little more difficult than a modern plastic kit would be, they are well within the capabilities of a modern model maker if they have the knowledge to do so, and that is what I wanted to make this video about. Take care and take your time, don't rush. Check the parts against the instructions, the pictures of the model and historical photographs. Clean up the mould lines and flashing and give all the parts a wash in normal soapy water, rinse and dry. Bend the parts back into shape carefully and test fit everything, every joint. Superglue and kicker, as much as I hate superglue, it's pretty much the most appropriate glue for this type of model. Take your time, hold the parts until the glue holds, prop them up if you need to, and then flood the joins with more glue wherever it isn't going to be visible, and then paint it as you normally would. So again, I admit that I was wrong with my initial assessment. These models aren't as nice as I thought they would be. The detail is great, they look fantastic, but they are a lot more fragile than I would expect from a wargaming model. The difficulty building isn't so bad, but you do have to pay attention, and it is a different process from what most modern wargamers are used to with plastic models. But I do hope this video has served to help you build this type of model, if maybe not this exact example, showing the steps that I take to ensure that it goes together properly, even as I learn to not underestimate them myself. Comment below if you have any other questions or suggestions for extra steps to make it easier. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.